The storm had come out of nowhere that night, washing over the city in blinding sheets of rain, drowning out the sounds of everything except the wind and thunder. Lily Harper drove slowly, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes straining to see more than a few feet ahead. Her shift at the cafe had run later than expected, and all she wanted was to get home, kick off her soaked shoes, and wrap herself in the comfort of her tiny apartment. But as she navigated the winding bypass road that cut through the outskirts of town, her headlights swept across something that made her foot slam hard on the brakes. The car was crumpled against a tree, its front end smashed, the windshield cracked in a spiderweb pattern that glinted in the lightning. Red hazard lights blinked through the downpour like a warning. For a moment, Lily sat frozen, her mind racing. People didn't stop anymore. She'd heard too many stories about setups and criminals, and part of her screamed at her to keep driving. But then she saw him. A man stumbling from the wreckage, his hand clutching the side of the car, his body swaying in the storm. Even in the near darkness, she could tell he was bleeding, the rain washing streaks of red down his face. Lily pushed open her door, the wind tearing it from her hand and slamming it back against her car. She braced herself, heart pounding, as she ran toward him. The mud sucked at her shoes and the rain stung her face like needles. She was shouting before she even reached him. "Hey! Are you okay?" He turned his head toward her, his blue eyes dazed and unfocused. "No signal," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "I tried, there's no signal." She was close enough now to see how pale he was, how unsteady his legs had become. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in clothes that clung to him, ruined by the rain. An expensive shirt, she realized, one that no normal person would be wearing in the middle of a storm on an empty road. But it didn't matter. None of that mattered. "You need help," she said firmly, sliding her arm around his waist before he could collapse. "There's a hospital in town, but we have to walk. Can you do that?" He didn't argue. He just nodded grimly and leaned into her, his weight heavy but manageable as they started down the road. Every step was a battle against the wind. The rain came at them sideways, cold enough to bite. She could hear his breath in her ear, rough, ragged. Every few feet he stumbled, and every time she caught him, tightening her grip and dragging him forward. "What's your name?" she asked at one point, just to keep him conscious. "Nicholas," he said after a pause, his voice tight with pain. "Nicholas Blake." It meant nothing to her in that moment, though later she'd wonder how she hadn't recognized the name immediately. All she cared about then was keeping him moving, one foot in front of the other, until finally, far down the road, headlights cut through the darkness. A truck was coming toward them, its engine roaring above the storm. She waved frantically with one arm while holding Nicholas up with the other. The driver stopped without hesitation, jumping out to help haul Nicholas into the cab. Lily climbed in after him, soaked to the bone and shaking from the cold and adrenaline. They made it to the hospital in minutes. Nicholas was rushed inside, doctors and nurses surrounding him, voices sharp and urgent. Lily stood alone in the waiting area, arms wrapped around herself, dripping water onto the sterile floors. She could leave. She told herself she should leave. She'd done her part, but she couldn't make her legs move. Half an hour later, a man in a tailored suit approached her, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, a face like it had been carved from stone. "You're the one who brought Mr. Blake in," he said. It wasn't a question. Lily nodded slowly. "Yes. I'm Daniel Grayson," he said. "He's assistant." Of course he had an assistant, Lily thought. A man like that, with clothes that cost more than her rent, wouldn't be walking around alone without someone managing his life. But none of that explained why Daniel was looking at her like she was some kind of anomaly. "He's going to be okay?" she asked, even though she wasn't sure why it mattered so much. "He'll recover," Daniel said. "But Mr. Blake doesn't typically allow people in. It's unusual." "I didn't exactly give him a choice," Lily said. "He was unconscious." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you. On behalf of Mr. Blake." She took the hint. She stood, smoothing her wet clothes down as best she could, and turned to leave. But she only got a few steps before she heard his voice. "Lily." She stopped, her stomach twisting. She turned back to see Nicholas himself, standing unsteadily in the doorway, hospital gown hanging loose, his arm in a sling, his blue eyes finding hers. He looked tired, fragile, in a way that startled her. But there was something else there too, a flicker of something alive. "You stayed," he said, as if it surprised him. "I wasn't sure you'd be okay," she admitted, His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Thank you. You don't have to," she said quickly. "I'm glad you're all right." He looked at her like he wanted to say more, but a nurse was already ushering him back inside. Lily turned and left before he could. She tried to forget about it. She tried to convince herself that it was over, that she had done what anyone would have done, and it meant nothing. But 2 days later, Nicholas Blake walked into the cafe where she worked. He didn't belong there. Everything about him screamed power and control. And the moment he stepped through the door, the quiet conversations stopped. Lily was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, when she looked up and saw him watching her. "Coffee," he said when he reached the register. "Black." She gave him a look. "You don't strike me as a black coffee kind of guy." He smirked faintly. "I'm not. But I needed an excuse to talk to you." She sighed and made the coffee anyway, sliding it across the counter. "You could have just said hello. Where's the fun in that?" He replied. He didn't drink the coffee. He just stood there watching her, until finally he said, "I want to offer you a job." Lily froze. "What? You saved my life," Nicholas said simply. "And I don't believe in debts." "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I didn't help you because I expected something." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm offering." She stared at him, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Doing what?" "My assistant," he said. "You'd work directly for me." She laughed, shaking her head. "I'm a waitress." "You're more than that," he said. "You're smart, you don't take crap from anyone, and you don't treat me like I'm untouchable." She folded her arms. "What if I say no?" "I'll ask again tomorrow," he said. And the day after. In the end, she agreed to try it. 1 month. That was the deal. The next morning, she stood in front of the towering glass building that bore his name, feeling completely out of place. Inside, Daniel met her with the same impassive look. He didn't approve, but he didn't argue. Nicholas greeted her with a nod and a faint smile. "You came," he said. "I said I would." Lily replied. The days that followed were unlike anything she had ever known. Nicholas moved fast. He expected her to move faster. Meetings blurred together, calls came in rapid succession, and she had to learn on the fly. But she did. She adapted. She started to understand how he worked, how he thought. She noticed things about him. How he tapped his pen when he was thinking. How he paced when he was frustrated. How he was alone, even in a room full of people. One night, long after everyone else had gone home, she found herself still at her desk, working through a list of tasks. Nicholas came out of his office and stood beside her. "You're still here," he said. "So are you," she replied. "I own the place. I'm trying to prove I belong here," she said. "You do," he said quietly, and she believed him. She wasn't sure when it changed. When their conversations shifted from work to something more personal. When he started asking her about her life. And she found herself asking about his. When he stopped being Nicholas Blake, CEO, and became Nicholas, just Nicholas. One night, he showed up at her apartment with pizza and a terrible movie. They sat on her couch, laughing until they couldn't breathe. And when he looked at her, something had changed. Something she couldn't quite name, but she felt it. He wasn't alone anymore. And neither was she. The first few weeks working alongside Nicholas Blake were unlike anything Lily Harper had ever experienced. It was as if she'd been thrust into another world entirely, one where the stakes were higher, the pace faster, and the pressure relentless. She had stepped into the eye of a storm that never seemed to stop moving, and every single day demanded more from her than the one before. Yet, somewhere in the middle of the chaos, Lily found herself rising to the challenge. She learned quickly that Nicholas expected precision. He wasn't a man who repeated himself. He valued initiative, rewarded foresight, and rarely had the patience for mistakes. But beneath that sharp exterior, there was something else. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on at first. He was guarded, yes, but it wasn't arrogance or coldness. It was something deeper. Like a man who had spent so long building walls that he wasn't sure how to let them down anymore. Lily's days started before the sun rose and ended long after it had disappeared behind the skyline. Mornings were a blur of meetings and briefings, and afternoons were spent shadowing Nicholas as he negotiated deals with the kind of ease that most people only pretended to have. She sat in on conversations where millions of dollars shifted hands with a handshake, where entire companies were bought and sold before lunch. And through it all, Nicholas kept an eye on her, as if testing her. waiting to see if she'd buckle under the weight of it. But she didn't. At first, she thought it was sheer stubbornness keeping her in the game. But after a while, it became something more. She wanted to be there. She wanted to understand the complexities of his world, not just for him but for herself. The girl who once thought her future ended behind the counter of a small cafe was now holding her own in conversations with executives who had spent years clawing their way to the top. And each time she succeeded, she saw something flicker in Nicholas's eyes. Approval maybe, or something closer to pride. One evening, they stood by the massive windows in his office. The city sprawled out beneath them like a living, breathing thing. The lights from the buildings reflected off the glass, casting a glow across his face. He looked tired but thoughtful. "You surprise me," he said quietly. Lily glanced at him. "I get that a lot." He chuckled under his breath, the sound low and rare. "No, I don't think you do." She tilted her head, curious. "What's that supposed to mean?" He took a long breath, as if weighing his words. "People underestimate you. They see a woman working in a cafe and assume that's all there is. But it's not." She was quiet for a moment. "Maybe I let them believe that." Nicholas turned his head, his eyes on her. "Wah." She shrugged, her gaze drifting back to the skyline. "It's easier. Less complicated." He was silent, considering her answer. Then he said something she wasn't expecting. "You don't have to be easy for anyone, Lily." The words settled between them, heavier than the air itself, and when she finally looked at him again, his expression was unreadable, but there was something softer there. Something almost vulnerable. The following days slipped by in a blur of deals and late nights. Nicholas started involving her in meetings she never thought she'd sit in, asking for her input in decisions that seemed far beyond her reach. But she spoke up anyway, offering suggestions that made seasoned board members pause, and Nicholas listened. He didn't humor her, he listened. And slowly, she realized that his belief in her wasn't just professional. He trusted her in a way that felt deeper, more personal. One Friday night, after an exhausting week, he suggested they take a break. Not in the usual sense. No meetings rescheduled, no deadlines shifted. He simply said, "Come with me," and led her to the private elevator without another word. They ended up in an art gallery on the quiet side of the city. It was after hours, the space empty except for them, and the faint sound of classical music, playing softly through hidden speakers. The walls were lined with paintings, each one more breathtaking than the last. But Nicholas didn't look at the art. He looked at her. "I bought this place a few years ago," he said. "I thought it would be a good investment." Lily raised a brow, taking in the collection around them. "And now," he said, stepping closer, "she's a place where I can be alone." She studied him, the sharp lines of his face softened by the dim light. "You don't strike me as someone who enjoys being alone." "I don't," he admitted. "Not anymore." There was a moment, long and charged, where neither of them moved, and then he reached for her hand. His fingers brushed against hers lightly at first, as if giving her time to pull away. She didn't. "I don't know what this is," he said, his voice low, honest. "But I know I don't want it to stop." Lily's heart raced. She wasn't sure what scared her more, the way he was looking at her or the way it made her feel. She had spent so long guarding herself, convinced that a life like his could never intersect with hers in any real way. But now, standing there with his hand in hers, she wasn't so sure anymore. "Men neither," she whispered. He smiled, and it was something rare, something real. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. They spent hours in the gallery, walking quietly from piece to piece, his hand never leaving hers. As they drove back to her apartment that night, Nicholas kept stealing glances at her, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles where their hands rested between them. He walked her to her door, hesitating on the threshold. "Dinner tomorrow?" he asked. She smiled. "Are you asking me out on a date, Nicholas Blake?" He smirked. "I'm asking you to have dinner with me. What happens after that is up to you." She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his cheek. "Dinner sounds good." He nodded, his smile lingering as he stepped back. "Good night, Lily." "Good night," she replied, watching him walk away. The next day, true to his word, Nicholas picked her up at 7 sharp. He wasn't dressed like the CEO she'd come to know. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, his hair less perfectly styled. He looked normal, human. He took her to a small restaurant on the outskirts of the city, a place she never would have expected. It was cozy, with mismatched chairs and a menu handwritten on a chalkboard. This was my mother's favorite place, he said as they sat down. She brought me here when I was a kid. Lily smiled. You're full of surprises, he chuckled. You have no idea. Dinner was easy. They talked about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood, about the years he spent trying to outrun his father's legacy. She told him about her dreams, the ones she'd buried under the weight of practicality. Afterward, they walked along the pier, the night air cool and refreshing. He slipped his hand into hers again, his thumb tracing slow circles against her skin. You make me feel different, he said quietly. She glanced up at him. Different how? Like I don't have to be him all the time, he said, nodding toward the looming skyline in the distance. Nicholas Blake. CEO, billionaire. She stopped walking and turned to face him. You don't. He leaned down then, his forehead resting against hers. I don't want to lose this. You won't, she whispered. When he kissed her it was slow, careful, like he was still learning how. And maybe he was. Maybe they both were. In the weeks that followed, their worlds began to intertwine in ways Lily hadn't expected. She still worked by his side every day, still kept pace with the demands of his business. But after hours they found something softer between them. Dinners that turned into long walks, nights spent talking until dawn, quiet moments where he let his guard down and she let herself believe in something more. One evening, as they sat on his penthouse balcony watching the sun set over the city, he reached for her hand. I don't know where this is going, he said, but I want you here. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He smiled, his fingers tightening around hers, and for the first time in a long time, Lily Harper felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The days slipped into weeks, and what had started as an unexpected twist in Lily Harper's life was quickly becoming something she could no longer dismiss as temporary. Each morning, she walked through the gleaming glass doors of Blake Industries, past receptionists who now greeted her by name, and into a world that had once felt intimidating but was slowly starting to feel like hers. There was still that moment every now and then, when she caught her reflection in the polished elevator doors or stood at the head of a conference table, that she questioned how she had ended up here. But Nicholas had made her promise not to talk herself out of what she had earned. And somehow, she was earning it. She wasn't just Nicholas Blake's assistant anymore. She had become his second pair of eyes, his sounding board, his voice of reason when tempers flared behind the closed doors of boardrooms. The more he let her in, the more she understood the empire he had built, and the more she realized it wasn't just about money and power for him. It was about control. Nicholas was a man who had built walls to protect himself, and now, for reasons she was still trying to understand, he was slowly letting her walk through them. They spent long hours together, and it wasn't always work that kept them there. Some nights, after everyone else had left the building, they'd find themselves sitting in his office, the city lights flickering behind him as they talked about anything and everything. She told him about growing up in a small town she'd left behind years ago. About her mother who taught her how to bake but died too young to see her daughter chase dreams she hadn't yet dared to name. He listened, really listened, with the same focus he gave his biggest deals. And Nicholas. He told her about his father, the man who'd taught him that strength meant keeping people at a distance, that love was a liability, and that vulnerability was weakness. It had taken years for Nicholas to claw his way out from under that shadow. Years to become the kind of man who could control a room with a look, who could turn fortunes with a word. But it had cost him something. Lily was starting to understand that he wasn't sure he could get it back. One night, after a particularly brutal meeting, where Nicholas had shut down an entire project without hesitation, Lily found him alone in his office, staring out the window. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled up, and his tie loose at his throat. He didn't look like a billionaire then. He looked tired. She stepped inside quietly, not wanting to break the moment. You were hard on them, she said softly. They were sloppy, he replied, his voice as sharp as the lines of his suit. We can't afford sloppy. You were hard on yourself, she said, walking closer. And they're not you. He turned then, his gaze finding hers, and for a moment, the weight he carried seemed too heavy for even him. I don't know how to be anyone else, he admitted. You don't have to, she said. But you don't have to carry it all alone either. His jaw worked as if he wanted to argue, but then he let out a long breath and dropped into the chair behind his desk. A sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. She did, and they sat in silence for a while, the city stretching out beneath them like a promise. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter. You make me think there's another way. There is, she said. You just have to be willing to see it. He looked at her for a long time, and she felt the air shift between them. It was always like this with Nicholas. Charged, tense. Like something was always about to happen but hadn't yet. She wasn't sure who was holding it back. Maybe they both were. But things didn't stay simple. They never did. The next morning, Daniel Grayson met her at the elevator with a tight expression and an envelope in his hand. We need to talk, he said. Lily followed him to a corner of the floor where no one else was around. He handed her the envelope. This is a non-disclosure agreement, he said. Standard procedure. For what? She asked, frowning. For whatever this is, he said, gesturing vaguely between her and Nicholas. You've become part of his inner circle. That carries weight. And risk, she said, understanding now. Daniel nodded. Not everyone is going to be happy you're here. Lily took the envelope, her fingers brushing the thick paper. Are you? Daniel was silent for a moment. It's not my job to be happy or not, he said finally. It's my job to protect Nicholas. If you're going to be close to him, you need to understand what that means. I do, she said quietly. You think you do, Daniel replied. Just be careful. She signed the agreement later that day, her hands steady even as her mind spun. She wasn't naive. She knew the world Nicholas lived in was cutthroat, and there were people who would see her as a threat or a weakness. But Nicholas had asked her to be there. That was enough. Later that evening, Nicholas found her still at her desk. Daniel told you, he said. He did, she replied. Nicholas studied her for a moment, then crossed the space between them. I'm sorry. Don't be, she said. I'm here because I want to be. He brushed a hand down her arm, his fingers lingering. I know. They left the office together that night, something they hadn't done before. Nicholas drove, his car quiet and fast, cutting through the city streets with ease. He didn't say where they were going, and she didn't ask. They ended up on the rooftop of a building she didn't recognize. The view was different from his office. Wider, less polished. The stars were brighter here, away from the heart of the city. This was my mother's favorite place, Nicholas said quietly, leaning against the railing. Before she died, she used to bring me here. Said it made her feel free. Lily stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. And you? He gave a faint smile. I didn't understand it then. I do now. They stood there for a long time, the wind cool against their skin, the city spread out like a living thing beneath them. And when he finally turned to her, his eyes searching hers, she didn't look away. He kissed her then. It wasn't rushed or uncertain. It was deliberate, like a decision made long ago but only now acted upon. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin, and she leaned into him because it felt right. Because maybe they both needed something to hold on to. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. This complicates everything, he murmured. Good, she whispered back. It should, and it did. They kept things quiet at work, but people noticed. Daniel watched them both more closely now, and there were rumors, though no one dared speak them aloud in front of Nicholas. Lily didn't care. She had spent too long pretending she was content with simple. She wasn't, not anymore. But with more came risk. It wasn't long before the first crack appeared. A deal Nicholas had been working on for months was suddenly in jeopardy. A rival company had gotten too close to sensitive information, and suspicions ran high. Daniel called her into his office one evening, his expression harder than she'd ever seen it. We're exposed, he said. And it started the day you arrived. Lily's stomach dropped. You think I had something to do with this? I don't know what to think, Danielle said, but I need to know if you're loyal. She stood, her hands clenched at her sides. I am. Prove it, he said. Nicholas believed her. She could see it in his eyes when she told him everything. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it didn't take much for it to grow. They fought for the first time that night. Words sharp and angry, fueled by fear neither of them wanted to admit to. Nicholas accused her of being reckless. She accused him of not trusting her, and in the middle of it, they both realized how much they had to lose. But they didn't give up. They worked together, side by side, tearing apart files, digging through emails, tracing leaks until they found the truth. It wasn't Lily. It was someone Nicholas had trusted for years. And when it was over, when the threat was neutralized, he turned to her in the quiet of his office and said, "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't be, just don't shut me out again." "I won't," he promised, and for once, she believed him. That night, they didn't talk about work. They didn't talk about what almost broke them. They just sat on his couch, her legs draped over his lap, his hand tracing idle circles on her knee, and they existed, together. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "What?" she asked. "Someone who stayed," he said. She smiled faintly. "I'm not going anywhere." And she meant it. For all the uncertainty, for all the chaos that came with being part of Nicholas Blake's world, Lily knew she had found something worth holding on to. So she did. It wasn't the smoothness of Nicholas Blake's world that made Lily stay. It wasn't the sharpness of his tailored suits, the precision of his penthouse office, or the silent power he carried into every room. It was the cracks. The moments when the man behind the title surfaced. When he wasn't CEO of a billion-dollar empire, but just a man trying to make sense of a life that had been carved out of expectation and control. Weeks passed, then months. And somehow Lily had gone from being the girl who poured coffee for strangers to the woman Nicholas turned to before anyone else. She wasn't sure when it changed. Maybe it was the night they worked through a proposal so late that she dozed off at the edge of his desk and woke up with his jacket draped over her shoulders. Or maybe it was the time he canceled a meeting, something no one thought he ever did, just to take her to the bookstore she mentioned missing. Whatever it was, they were different now. People noticed. Daniel watched them with a look Lily couldn't quite read. Protective maybe, skeptical. But he didn't interfere, and for that she was grateful. They'd kept it professional during the day. Mostly. But the line blurred more and more with each passing evening. They spent late hours going over plans and data, their conversations slipping into quieter, personal territory by the time the city lights dimmed in the early morning haze. She learned how Nicholas took his coffee, black but with a splash of cream if he was going into a tense meeting. He learned that she hummed when she was focused, always a little off key but never aware of it. And then there were the nights he showed up at her apartment without warning. She'd find him standing outside her door, holding takeout in one hand and looking at her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored. On those nights, he was just Nicholas, not the man who signed deals that changed entire industries, but someone who could sit cross-legged on her worn couch and talk about nothing at all. One Friday evening, as they walked back from dinner at a small place by the river, one of those rare nights when neither of them was in a suit, Lily felt his hand slip into hers. It was casual, easy, but it made her heart twist in a way she didn't want to analyze. He didn't let go, even when they reached her building. "Stay," she said as she unlocked the door. He didn't hesitate. He followed her in, took off his coat, and wandered toward her bookshelf like he'd done it 1,000 times. She watched him from the kitchen. The way he traced his fingers over the spines of her books. How he paused at the photo of her mother tucked into a frame on the windowsill. "You still think this is temporary?" he asked, turning to face her. She set the mugs down on the counter. "I stopped thinking that a while ago." He nodded, something shifting in his expression. M2. That night wasn't like the others. It wasn't full of conversations about work or soft silences while they read in the same space. It was something deeper, something neither of them said out loud, but both felt as they moved around each other, brushing shoulders, sharing quiet glances. He kissed her in the doorway of her bedroom. Slow and deliberate, like a promise. When they woke up tangled together the next morning, the sun streaming in through thin curtains, Lily realized something had changed, and there was no going back. Nicholas stayed longer that day than he'd ever stayed before. They made breakfast together, if you could call burnt toast and coffee breakfast, and sat on the floor eating it off mismatched plates. She caught him smiling when he thought she wasn't looking. He caught her staring at him while he read emails on his phone. They didn't talk about what came next. It was too soon for that. But when he left, he kissed her like he wasn't walking out of her apartment. Like he was walking into something new. Work the following Monday felt different, but only because she realized it wasn't hard to be around him anymore. It was easy. Natural. She understood how he thought, anticipated his needs before he said them. And he trusted her, in a way that no one else seemed to understand. But not everyone was happy about the change. Whispers started circulating around the office. Comments that were just loud enough for her to hear, women she passed in the halls who suddenly stopped meeting her eyes. And then there was Daniel, who called her into his office one afternoon and closed the door behind her. "You've become important to him," Danielle said without preamble. "That means you'll have enemies you won't see coming." Lily crossed her arms, refusing to flinch. "Is this supposed to scare me?" "It's supposed to prepare you," Daniel replied. "Nicholas has enemies. People who don't fight clean. People who use you to get to him." She held his gaze. "I'm not a liability." "No, greed," he agreed. "But you're a target now." Later that night, when Nicholas found her sitting quietly on his office sofa, staring out at the city, he didn't have to ask. He knew something was wrong. "Talk to me," he said, sitting beside her. She exhaled slowly. "Daniel thinks someone's going to come after me." Nicholas's jaw tightened. "Daniel worries because it's his job. And because he's probably right," she added. Nicholas took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "I'll protect you." "You can't control everything," she said softly. "I can control enough," he replied, and for once, she let herself believe him. The first real test came a week later. A rival company leaked rumors that Lily was behind confidential information being exposed. It hit the media fast and hard. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Paparazzi followed her when she left for work. Headlines painted her as the woman who slept her way into power. Nicholas acted instantly. Legal teams were deployed. Public statements were released. But it wasn't until he walked into a press conference with Lily at his side, his hand wrapped around hers in full view of the cameras, that the narrative changed. "She's not a liability," he said clearly. She's the future of this company." The reporters shouted questions. Some called it a distraction, others demanded proof, but Nicholas stood there, unflinching, making it clear to everyone watching that Lily Harper wasn't a mistake. She was his choice. Afterward, when they were back in his office, doors locked and the building quiet again, Lily stared at him across his desk. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I did." She crossed the room, stopping just in front of him. "Why me?" He reached up, brushing his fingers across her jaw. "Because you saw me before anyone else did. Not the CEO, not the billionaire, just me." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I don't want to be the reason people come after you. You're the reason I can stand it," he said. They didn't speak again for a long time. Words weren't necessary. He kissed her like he needed the reminder that she was real, that they were here together, in spite of everything trying to pull them apart. And, for the first time in his life, Nicholas Blake wasn't just fighting for his company. He was fighting for someone who made him want to be a better man. The months that followed tested them. Competitors tried to exploit their relationship. Old alliances shifted. Friends became enemies. But Lily stood beside Nicholas through it all, never backing down, never stepping aside. And Nicholas changed. Slowly at first. He took days off. Real days off. They went away for weekends, nowhere fancy, just places where they could be alone. He smiled more. Laughed, even. He stopped measuring his success by the number of zeros on a contract, and started measuring it by the moments they shared. One night, after a long day of negotiations that ended in a hard-won victory, they sat on his balcony, legs tangled together, sharing a bottle of wine. "What happens now?" Lily asked, her voice quiet. Nicholas looked at her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "Now, we built something that's ours." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I like the sound of that." And they did, not without mistakes, not without fights, but they built something real. The girl who once worked in a cafe became a woman who helped run an empire. And the man who once thought love was a weakness discovered it was his greatest strength. Together, they rewrote the rules. Together, they found a life that was more than either of them had imagined. And neither of them ever walked away. The quiet hum of the city beneath them had long faded into the background, replaced by the soft sound of rain against the glass of Nicholas Blake's penthouse windows. Lily stood barefoot in the living room, one hand wrapped around a mug of tea, the other holding the heavy silence that hung between them. Nicholas was watching her. He always watched her, as if waiting for the moment she might vanish like a mirage he was afraid to reach for too quickly. But she wasn't going anywhere. She had told him that 1,000 times without needing to say it at all. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice low as he came up behind her. His fingers brushed against her shoulder lightly, but the weight of his presence was grounding. She smiled faintly. "Neither can I." For weeks, they'd been spinning inside the storm of their lives. The company was growing, shifting in ways Nicholas had once orchestrated with surgical precision, but now found himself letting Lily guide. Her insight had become something his board respected, something his competitors feared. And yet, it wasn't her sharpness in meetings or the way she disarmed an entire room with 3 words that kept him awake at night. It was her. The idea of losing her, of not knowing who he was before she walked into his life, and how terrifying it would be if she ever chose to walk back out. He slipped his hand around her waist, pulling her back against him. "We're doing this," he murmured, as if needing to remind himself it was real. She nodded. "We are." It wasn't a question anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. The night he'd first told her he loved her wasn't something out of a movie. It wasn't under moonlight or on some extravagant getaway. It was on a Tuesday, a brutal Tuesday, after they'd spent 12 hours battling through negotiations that had left everyone at the table frayed and exhausted. She had stepped into his office that evening, still wearing the same blouse she'd spilled coffee on that morning, and handed him a file he'd been waiting on. She hadn't even said anything, just gave him that small, tired smile, the one that always made his chest tighten, and he'd said it. "I love you." She had blinked, stunned silent for the first time since he'd met her. Then she'd smiled, stepped in close and whispered it back. No fanfare, no grand declarations, just them real, simple. Now, standing in his penthouse with the rain and the quiet, he thought about that moment as he kissed the side of her neck. He could give her anything. He'd already offered her the world. But the one thing he hadn't given anyone before was the truth of who he was. And that was what she held in her hands every day, not just his name, not his empire, but him. He drew back just enough to look at her. "Come away with me." She glanced at him, brow arching slightly. "Anywhere," he said. "Everywhere." She laughed soft and warm. "You're serious?" "I am." His hand skimmed over her hip. "Just you and me. No calls, no cameras waiting outside." "Sounds dangerous," she teased. "Sounds necessary," he replied, his thumb brushing against her jaw. "I want to see you somewhere that isn't defined by what I do. I want to be with you without this." He gestured around them. "Justice." It wasn't a business decision. It wasn't calculated. It was Nicholas Blake being a man who finally understood that some things couldn't be scheduled. She studied him, quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay." They left 3 days later, no driver, no security detail. Just Nicholas behind the wheel of a car that had no business being driven in anything less than perfect weather, and Lily in the passenger seat, hair tied up messily, sunglasses hiding the way she kept watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. They drove until the city was nothing more than a distant glow behind them. They stopped at a small coastal town, the kind of place where no one recognized him, where she could slip her hand into his as they walked through markets without anyone snapping a photo. They ate seafood on a wooden pier, drank cheap wine from plastic cups, and slept in a rented cottage with creaky floors and a door that stuck every time they tried to open it. And Nicholas was happy. For the first time since he was a boy. Before his life was mapped out in quarterly reports and stock projections, he was happy in a way that had nothing to do with power. He carried Lily's sandals on the beach when she kicked them off to walk barefoot in the sand. He let her teach him how to cook something beyond pasta and eggs. And even though he burned it, she kissed him anyway. They spent hours on the back porch of that cottage, wrapped in a blanket, talking about nothing and everything until they fell asleep under the stars. One night, they sat by the fireplace, the air outside cold enough to make Lily curl up in his lap. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You ever think about forever?" she asked. He ran his fingers through her hair, slow and steady. "I used to think it was impossible. And now." He kissed the top of her head. "Now I know it's a choice." She tilted her face up to his, her gaze steady. "And you're choosing it?" He nodded. "With you." It wasn't the kind of conversation that ended in diamonds or grand proposals. That would come later. But in that moment, it was a promise. The kind that mattered more than a ring. When they finally returned to the city, nothing had changed, and everything had. The company was still there, the meetings, the pressure. But Nicholas was different. People noticed. He was still ruthless when he needed to be. Still sharp, but there was something else. A calmness. A man who no longer needed to prove himself because he had already found what mattered. And Lily was still beside him. Months passed, and they settled into a life that was theirs. It wasn't always easy. They fought. They disagreed. She challenged him in ways no one else did, and he learned how to let her in, even when his instinct was to shut down. They made it work because they both chose it every day. One evening, as they hosted a small gathering in the penthouse, something they rarely did, Nicholas watched Lily move through the room with ease. She wasn't the girl who'd walked into his life during a storm, soaking wet and stubborn. She was the woman who'd helped him rebuild himself from the inside out. Daniel approached him, 2 glasses in hand. "You're different," he said. Nicholas took one of the glasses. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Daniel shook his head. "It's not." They stood there for a moment, silent. Then Daniel added, "You picked well." Nicholas's gaze followed Lily across the room. She caught him staring and smiled, that soft, private one she reserved just for him. "Wes," he said quietly, "I did." Later that night, when the apartment was quiet again, Nicholas found her standing by the window, looking out over the city. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Marry me," he said. She smiled. "You're not even trying to be romantic." "I'm serious," he said, turning her gently to face him. "I want this you." Every day, she studied him, searching his face. Then she nodded. Yes. It was simple, it was quiet, and it was everything. They didn't need an audience, they didn't need an elaborate ceremony, they needed each other, and that was enough. The wedding was small, just a handful of people they trusted. Daniel stood at Nicholas's side. Lily's oldest friend flew in from halfway across the world to stand with her. There were no photographers, no headlines. Just vows spoken in voices thick with emotion, promises made under an open sky, and a kiss that sealed a life they'd both fought hard to have. Afterward, as they sat on the steps of the house where they'd held the ceremony, Lily leaned her head on Nicholas's shoulder. "You know," she said, "when I pulled you out of that car, I thought I was saving your life." He laughed softly. "You did." She smiled. "No, you saved mine." He kissed her temple. "We saved each other." And they did. Every day, Nicholas Blake didn't need another empire. He didn't need another zero in his bank account. What he needed, he'd found in Lily Harper. And what she never believed she deserved, she found in him. They built a life that wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs, and they never let it go.